All right, so my plan for today is to try and finish just the last couple slides that I didn't get to in talking about the relationship between science and religion, and then talk about the humanities. So I'll talk about what that is and kind of why it's important. And then next week, we'll talk about relativism, which is a problem that I see that's connected to the humanities. So, kind of like we talked about the nature of science, and we talked about two problems with science that, like scientism, that idea that science is like the only game in town. It's the only way to get knowledge. Everything else just gives you opinion or something like that. And then we, for the most part, talked about the relationship between science and religion. So again, we'll kind of repeat that same structure with the humanities. We'll talk about what the humanities are, and then we'll say, like, here's kind of a problem with it when we talk about relativism next week. So let me pray and we'll get started. Dear Lord, I just thank you for this class. Lord, I thank you for all of the people that are here. Lord, for all the people that have come to it. I just thank you so much for them. I pray that you would bless them. Lord, I pray that you would bless our time together. Lord, I just ask that you would lead us into truth, that you would help us to think clearly and rightly about these things. Lord, that you would guide our thoughts and help me to explain things clearly and succinctly. And it's in your name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
All right. So where we left off last week in the sciences was, let's see, there we go, was we talked about kind of three different views about science and religion: the coextensive, that they cover the exact same thing; the non-overlapping, that they cover two totally separate things; and then the partially overlapping view, which is that science has its things that it talks about, religion has its things that it talks about, but they also have common ground. And that was kind of the position that I argued for a little bit. And one of the things that I talked about was about the ability of religion to provide a foundation for science, and to offer an explanation for certain phenomena. And I think we closed off here with this slide where I was talking about, actually, if you look at it, there's been deep historical harmony between science and religion. These are all like leading scientific thinkers that held religious views, or at least accepted God's existence, something like that. I talked about the number of Nobel Prize winners, that there's about 134 of them that were adherents of the Judeo-Christian religion, out of the 147, and that's in the area of physics, right? So the idea that like Christians don't do science or something like that, it's just blatantly false. They were the founders of modern science, and they have been the leaders of modern science since its inception. So where we kind of left off is like, okay, so you're saying there's this relationship between science and religion, but one of the problems with that is it means that science and religion can conflict, right? We talked about one of the reasons that people sometimes do that non-overlapping views. It's like parents with their kids. You know, when your kids are fighting, what do? You separate them. You're like, you go to your room, you go to your room, leave each other alone because you're arguing and fighting. And so just saying, well, science, it has nothing to do with religion. Religion, you have nothing to do with science. You guys stay apart. And then it's like, oh, now they can get along peaceably. So if we say, though, that no, they do have things that they overlap on, then what do we do when there is conflict, right? And so that's what I want to kind of finish out our discussion on science to do. The first thing that I want to do is talk about the nature of contradictions. I really would like at some point to do, and this is probably going to be even worse for you guys, to do like a Sunday school class on logic. I would like to do that a lot. And that's because I think it's really important for clear thinking. There are lots of times where there are things that people think are contradictions that are just simply not contradictions at all. And a lot of that comes from not understanding what a contradiction is, and how those things work. There's a great example of this from a guy named Mark Middleberg. And he was a Christian, and he said that he got, we have like the prayer tree, we get in like prayer requests and things like that. Debbie Austin sends them out. And his church did something like that. And they got a prayer request for this woman. And it said, please pray for, so-and-so. She was hit by a bus. And she's like at the hospital now. They're going to be doing surgery. Please pray for her. And then some other people like responded to that and were like, no, that's not true. That's wrong. She wasn't hit by a bus. She was in a car accident. She was riding with a friend and they got into a car accident. She wasn't wearing a seatbelt and she got hurt really badly. And so the question is like, well, which one is true? They're contradictory, right? On the one hand, she was hit by on a bus. On the other hand, she was in a car accident. Can they both be true? Yes, they can both be true. It's not actually a contradiction. And in fact, they both were true. This woman, what had happened was she was waiting at a bus stop with a friend and she like fell in front of the bus. The bus hit her. A bystander was like, oh my goodness, we have to get this woman to the hospital. Loaded her up in the car, drove off quickly to the hospital and got in a car accident on the way. She wasn't wearing a seatbelt because he just thrown her in the car. And then she had to be taken to the hospital. And you thought you were having a bad day, right? And so the thing is like a lot of times things that look like a contradiction really aren't a contradiction. And so we need to think very carefully about these things. And also sometimes what happens is it seems like science and religion are speaking on the same thing, but at different levels. Let me give an example of that. So the kidneys. Most translations don't use this anymore, but if you look at the Hebrew, and it actually carries over into the Greek a little bit, there's a lot of times where the Bible actually talks about the kidneys. In Psalm 7:9, it says, you, the righteous God, who probes minds and kidneys. Right? Now, is that saying like that God is doing like dialysis or something like that on people? Is this meant to be a statement about the biological function of kidneys? Or what about Proverbs 23:16? My kidneys will rejoice when your lips speak what is right. Or Jeremiah 12:2, you are always on their lips, but far from their kidneys. Right? Is that making a statement about like where God is spatially? Like he's up here, but he's not down by their kidneys or something like that. No, it's not meant to teach us anything about the biological function of kidneys, right? The kidneys, one, it was a way of talking about kind of like the inner person, right? So you could think of it as like their heart of hearts. You're on their lips, people talk about you, but really in their heart of hearts, you're far from them. They don't really care about you. They just give you kind of lip service, right? In my innermost being, I will rejoice when your lips speak what is right. The righteous God who probes minds and the inner recesses of the human person. That's what it's talking about there. Now, it's not meant to teach us biology, right? It has to use language. It uses language of the day. That was how people talked about their inner person, was they used their kidneys. They used a lot of different organs were kind of seats of emotions or the heart or like the inner person or the soul, those sorts of things were all just attributed to different like bodily organs. And so when at times scripture and religion is talking about these things, it might be talking about a spiritual meaning. It might be talking about value or importance. And it might not be meant to describe exactly in a scientific way nature. A good example here is it's Psalm 104, where it talks about God having fixed the foundations of the earth and that the earth will not be moved, right? Is that meant to tell us like, oh, yes, the sun revolves around the earth, right? Is that meant to teach like geocentrism as opposed to heliocentrism? No, that's not its point at all. Well, what's its point? Well, how many of you have like ever worried that gravity will stop working? Have you ever been like, I don't know if I want to go outside today? What if gravity just stops? I just float up, if I'm in here, at least I'll just hit the ceiling, the roof will catch me, I'll be okay, or how many of you have been like, what if the electrons in my house just don't want to work anymore? I don't know. I really worry about these things, right? Like, you don't have to worry about that. God has made the physical world in such a way that it will work, it will hold, and you don't need to worry about that. And there's a connection that the psalmist makes between the physical world and God's promises towards us, right? Just like you don't have to worry about gravity shutting off, you don't have to worry that God will forget you. You don't have to worry that God won't take care of you and provide for you. It is not teaching scientific doctrine. It is teaching you spiritual things. So there are times where, right, like when you have something like heliocentrism, that the sun is at the center of the solar system and that all the planets revolve around it. Psalms 104 isn't contradicting that. It's talking about something at a different level, right? And this is something that I hinted at last time. It's helpful to, I think of the way that the medievals looked at it. The medievals looked at it this way. God wrote 2 books, and books should probably be in quotes up there. He wrote 2 books. The one is the book of nature. God created the world. He made it. He made atoms. He made electrons. He made the law of gravity. God made the world. And then God also specially has spoken. He has specially spoken to the prophets. He specially spoke to the disciples. Scripture is an aspect of revelation, and he continues to specially speak to people. He continues to reveal himself in special ways. So you have the one book of nature, and you have the other book of Revelation. Those are the 2 books, and they have the same author. And so you know what? They don't disagree with each other. They're in perfect harmony because they have a perfect author and there is no contradictions. What happens though is that we read the books incorrectly. We look at nature and we think it's saying something over here, but it's really not saying that. Or we read the book of Revelation and we think it's saying something here and it's really not. And people did that. People read Psalm 104 and they thought it taught a geocentric model of the solar system, that the earth is at the center and the sun revolves around it. But that's misreading scripture. It's not that God made a mistake. It's not that there's a mistake in either of the 2 books that he wrote. The problem is with us readers, right? And so the issue, when we run into these problems, what we need to do is we need to read both books carefully and say, the problem is that I've made a mistake somewhere. Either this scientific thing isn't correct, or I'm misreading this thing over here, right? And it's worth pointing out, like Genesis is a main area here. I think there's a lot of Genesis that is speaking about spiritual truths. If you look, it's arranged in 2 sets of 3 in creative days, right? You have the heavens and the earth. And then on the 4th day, I don't know if I should do like dots here or something like that. That might be helpful. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So here you have something like light, dark, and heavens. On the 4th day, you have the things that live in those places: the sun, the moon, the stars. These are the things that live in those places. You have the land, the air, the seas. You have the things that populate those. You have birds. You have fish.
You have a block. You see, this red, I don't read it.
Oh,
Sorry.
I have green. Is that better?
Yes.
And then the main thing here is the earth. So is land itself then becomes habitable. And the things, so this is a separation that takes place here. And then this is a preparation for it. And of course, the pinnacle here is man, right? So you have places and then you have the things that live in those places and the corresponding days here. There's a lot of temple language. The idea that we talked about earlier is about how God created the world as a place for him to live, as a place for him to be, and for people to serve in his temple and to rule under him, right? That's kind of the picture that's going on here. Is it meant to give us an exact scientific outline? Maybe, maybe not, right? Maybe it's talking about this and it's not doing other stuff, right? Somewhere we've made a mistake. And what we need to do is we need to read both books and think carefully.
Yes.
Right? That's the way that we solve this. And not by screaming and shouting at each other or doing things like that. The problem is never with the books. The problem is always going to be with us readers. We're finite, we make mistakes. And I think lastly, to just kind of wrap up this section, I want to talk about science and its religious function. So this is again like part of that overlap between science and religion. Science covers things that revelation or more generally religion just does not cover, right? So you have commands in scripture about like go and be well and to let them have dominion over the earth. Well, in James, right, it says, don't just tell somebody, go and be well, and then do nothing about it. Like actually go and help the person. And Jesus speaks about the same thing. But what is it that will make somebody well? Should we give them asbestos? Should we give them tea? Is coffee okay? Is that helpful? Is that harmful to them? What about sugar? How much sugar can they have? Is that going to make them sick? Is that not going to make them sick? Right? What is it that makes a body function well? That is not answered by religion. Right? Whether caffeine is good for you or not is not answered by religion. So we have the command, we have the mandate to do it, but how we carry that out is something that we need science to help us to do, right? And so we can use science to help us to say, go and be well. And we can say, oh, here's some medicine for you, right? Here's some Advil, here's some Tylenol, here's this, here's prednisone. I'm a big fan of prednisone. I had a lot of poison ivy as a kid. I think it's great. Right? And so it's science that helps us to do these things. Let them have dominion over the earth. Again, God didn't tell Adam that and then whisper to him, gravity. It's a square inverse law. Okay, like he didn't tell him that. He left things up for us to figure out. He left things out for us to do, right? What it looks like for us to have dominion over the earth, to understand how agriculture works, how chemistry works, how biology works. All of those things are up to us. And science is really just the process of us carrying those things out. So again, we have a religious mandate to do these things, but to actually carry them out, we have to act in the material universe. And that means we have to understand the material universe. And what is the discipline that helps us to understand the material universe? It's science, right? And so religion actually, again, it provides a foundation for science. It explains why it's important, why it works, why are there rules for us to discover in the first place? Because there's a God who is the lawmaker, right? Who created the world. It provides that foundation for us. And then science in turn helps us to carry out those commandments and do it, right? Science is about controlling and understanding nature. That's part of us just carrying out that dominion over the earth, right? And there are, things that like God is just not going to do for us. He's given us time, matter, space, and energy. And if we're going to do these things, then we have to work with what he's given to us. We shouldn't pray that God will salt our eggs for us. He's given us arms. He's given us salt shakers. We should salt our own eggs. He wants us to participate with him. He wants us to partake. And that means exercising the functions that we have. And again, that includes science sometimes. So I'm going to transition PowerPoints. Any quick comments or thoughts or anything like that on science while I try and transition over? No? Okay. Well, since I didn't want to have to switch between PowerPoints, I wasn't able to put my little quote up on the screen, so I'll just read that real quickly. What is reality? What is the human being? What is the good life? What is happiness? In the older vision of the humanities, these questions were not set aside as abstract and secondary. They were not neglected in favor of the more practical, the more useful, the more relevant. Um, and I'll have to mention this guy later, but I don't know how to say his name. Ouwais Rafoudine. I think he is from Egypt, if I remember correctly. All right, so what are the humanities? I feel like probably unlike the sciences, we probably have even less of a grasp of the humanities. I know, like, I certainly did not have a very clear understanding of what the humanities were until I was probably quite a ways through college. Um, but in general, the humanities, it's probably the broadest collection of like little sub-disciplines. So you can think of disciplines as just little areas of study, right? Maybe a good way of thinking about it is what you could get a college degree in, right? So you could get a college degree in chemistry, you could get a college degree in biology, you could get a college degree in history, or in philosophy, or in religion. Those last ones would be things that would fall under the humanities. The humanities concerns the nature of, the history of, the acts of, the beliefs of, and the culture of humans. That's why it gets its names, the humanities, right? So if you remember in the sciences, we talked about the hard sciences. What is it that they purposefully exclude? All aspects of human experience, right? Remember, if somebody spits in your petri dish when you're doing your chemistry experiment, you have to chuck it out and you have to get a new one, right? You have to start over. But when we look at humans, right, we have to account for all of their behavior, right? We have to account for everything that's here. So humans become the focus. Maybe a helpful way of thinking about it is like the nature of humanity. That's something that falls under philosophy. The history of humanity falls under history. The culture of humanity falls under things like anthropology, literature, politics, art. Those are things that kind of fall under that cultural aspect. And again, just because I feel like this one is a little harder to grasp, I thought maybe some charts would be nice or helpful here. Again, you can just think of it as like things that you can know about, things that you can study, things that you can learn about. One of the things off of that is science, right? And what's it do? It looks at the natural world, time, matter, space, and energy. That's what it looks at, the physical world. The humanities looks at things relating to humans, and then the arts look at the arts. And really, the creative arts is like that. It's really a branch off of the humanities. Because it tends to be looked at differently. There's a lot of specialization involved here. It kind of gets treated almost as a separate section. But who is it that makes art? Humans. So it's part of the humanities. Um, and again, hopefully these charts aren't too boring and helpful. Another way that you can think of it is that humanities, it has all of these different things that fall underneath of it. You have philosophy, religion, art, politics, history, anthropology. And don't think of these as like watertight compartments. There's a lot of overlap and mixing, right? So especially if you think about history, right? There's the history of religion. There's a history of politics. There's a history of art. There's a history of philosophy. There's also a philosophy of history. So the history of philosophy would be like, well, you had Socrates and he had a student named Plato, and Plato had a student named Aristotle, right? That would be about the history of philosophy. The philosophy of history would be like, can we know the past without bias? Are we always reading our own culture and assumptions when we look into other cultures? Right? That's about the philosophy of history. So you have a history of philosophy of history. You have philosophy of religion. Philosophy is really one of the things that kind of covers all of these areas here, which is one of the things that I like about philosophy. It overlaps everything. Right? What's the meaning? What's the value? What's the importance of each one of these? That's a discussion of philosophy. What's the nature of blank? That's a philosophical question. What is the nature of religion? Philosophy answers that. What is the nature of history? Philosophy answers that. So maybe that's a helpful way of thinking about it, right? And again, like obviously there's lots of overlappings here. But that's just really what the humanities are about. They're looking at the things that humans have done. Another helpful kind of contrast with the humanities is to compare and contrast not divisions within the humanities, but outside of the humanities. So the sciences is going to be our main point of contrast here. The sciences tend to be very pragmatic. They tell us how to do things like how to build a bomb or how to cure cancer. Doesn't tell us which one we should do or which one we ought to do. Doesn't tell us whether we should use that bomb. It doesn't tell us whether we should cure that cancer or not. It just tells us how, right? It's very pragmatic in that way, and it's very descriptive, right? So it describes a falling rock, or it describes what a cell structure is. You can think about like, like a trajectory of a rock. It says, well, if you throw it at this speed and it weighs this much and gravity has this force on it, then the curve will look like this. Or if you throw it a little faster, the arch will look this way. It'll look a little different here. It's just describing things to you. All the laws of nature do is describe what happens when you do something. They all essentially boil down to, if you do this, this will happen. If you drop this rock, it will fall, and it will fall at this rate. If you throw this rock, this will happen. If you mix chemical X and chemical Y, this will happen. They're just descriptive, right? They're not saying, and you should mix chemical X and Y. They're not saying that. They're just describing things. The humanities, on the other hand, are very idealistic. They're focused on things like contemplation, wonder, and beauty, right? It's not about how can I do this? How can I get this job done? How can I be pragmatic or practical, right? And it's about like, isn't that wonderful? Isn't that beautiful? Like what is it that you're going to get done? What is it that you're going to accomplish? Like sitting up on the parkway and looking at the leaves in fall, And in terms of like doing something, nothing really. You're going to make money that way? No, right? But to contemplate it, to look at the beauty of nature, right? That's what the humanities do. Where did we come from? What was it like to live in ancient Greece, right? Those are things that we wonder about. What would it be like to be over here, to have been born here? What would it be like to do this, right? And they're very prescriptive. They do tell us what we should do and what we shouldn't do. They focus a lot on how to be a better person, right? Think about all of those disciplines that we looked at on that previous slide, right? Religion tells you what you should and shouldn't do. Politics tells you what you should and shouldn't do. Art, depiction of the good and the beautiful. Philosophy, one of the main branches of philosophy is ethics, what you should and shouldn't do. History, descriptive, but also, right? Don't do this because this happened. People did this and then this bad thing happened, right? The study of culture and stuff too, like like people study things like the Nazis or World War II, and it's like, don't do this. This is not good. This is bad. Here are lessons that we can learn from this. Right? So so they're very prescriptive. The humanities are often instructive in this area. And really, I kind of want to emphasize this a point again. Anytime you see prescription in the sciences, you see a scientist who is speaking outside their domain. What you should and should not do is not part of science. There's an article at Liberty that students used to have to read. And what it did was it actually talked about the relationship between praying for your spouse and how likely you are to commit adultery. And one of the things that the scientific study showed was that the more you saw marriage as a sacred institution And the more you prayed for your spouse, the less likely you were to commit adultery. The less you prayed and the less you saw your marriage as something sacred, the more likely you were to commit adultery. And they're like, well, isn't that interesting? As the one goes up, the other goes down. As the one goes up, the other one goes down, right? There's a relationship between here. Nowhere in that article does it ever say, therefore, don't cheat on your spouse. Nowhere in that article does it say, therefore, you should pray for your spouse. That is not part of science. It describes, it says, look, there's a relation. If you want to go beyond that, you have to go beyond science, right? You have to say something like things like honesty and integrity and commitment are valuable. And those are things that lie outside of science, right? So science can be helpful for some of this stuff, but it cannot speak directly to them. It can't tell us what we ought or ought not to do, right? There are times where killing cells in your body is good and times where killing cells in your body is not good, right? Should we preserve life or should we not preserve life? Right? Science cannot speak to that. Philosophy can speak to it. Religion can speak to that, right? But science can't. It can tell us how to preserve life or how to not preserve life, but it can't tell us what we should or shouldn't do. What I want to do now is kind of talk a little bit more about what is the purpose of the humanities. Overall, the humanities are something that is very, very neglected, both in education and just kind of society overall. Like you think a lot about that push for technology that I talked about earlier in the course. There's a big emphasis on science, or people talk about like STEM and stuff. We need engineers, we need all of this, we need people that are doing stuff, you know? And again, I think I've mentioned this a couple of times. These kind of lectures are based off of stuff that I did at Liberty. And there's a lot of people that it's like, look, I'm an engineer. I have to take this boring calculus class. I have to take boring calculus class because it helps me to build bridges. And it helps me to build bridges because that helps me to make money. So I get why I have to do boring calculus class, right? Because it contributes money to me. Why do I have to take a history class? Huh? What do I get out of that? How's that going to put money in my pocket? Why do I have to take a New Testament class? Why should I take a philosophy class? Why should I take an English class? Why should I read poetry? Why should I read literature? How's that going to benefit me? How's that going to give me money? Right? And what I want to say is like, well, first of all, who's going to be building bridges? People. Right? Who are you going to be working with? People. Well, maybe you should know what a people is. Maybe you should know what a person is, what a good person is. Who are you? Where do you come from? Right? Who is a good person? Maybe you should know those sorts of things. You are not an engineer. You are a human. That is what you are fundamentally. And you should know what that is, right? That is what your well-being is. You can be an excellent engineer and a terrible person. You know, so we should know what a person is. And so these things are very important. And at the heart of the humanities is really about knowing ourselves. Who am I? What am I? God created us with a nature, right? What is that nature? And that's something that we can find out by looking at the past, by looking at other cultures, by looking at art. When we get to art in 2 weeks, I think that's one of the things that we'll see is that art has a special ability to tell us about ourselves. I want to read to you a quote here. This is from Socrates. It's Xenophon was the guy that wrote it down, but we don't need to worry about that. Anyways, he says, what do you suppose a man must know to know himself? His own name merely? Or must he consider what sort of creature he is? Is it not clear that through self-knowledge men come to much good and through self-deception to much harm? For those who know themselves know what things are expedient for themselves and discern their own powers and limitations. If you don't know who you are or what you are, you're not going to make good choices. You're going to make bad choices, things that harm you. A healthy person is not the same thing as a healthy squirrel or a healthy piece of broccoli, right? If it's green all over and it's broccoli, it's perfectly fine. If it's green all over and it's a person, they're not doing so well, right? If it doesn't wear clothes and it lives in a tree and it's a squirrel, it's perfectly fine. If it doesn't wear clothes and it lives in a tree and it's a human, it's not doing so well, right? It's got some real issues here. You see, driving home, you see some guy living in a tree without any clothes on. You're like, that guy needs some help, right? Right? We have to know who we are. What is our nature? How did God make us? Right? In order to make good decisions about ourselves. And the older view of education, really education at all, I should get rid of that higher part there. The older view of education was a liberal arts education, and that it was about knowing yourself. And the humanities was one of the main focuses of a liberal education. So let me just talk about a liberal education real quickly here. First of all, let's talk about what the word liberal means, because it gets used in different contexts. What I don't mean by liberal, right, is say like somebody who voted for Harris a little while back. I don't mean somebody that's like a registered Democrat, right? That's not the original meaning of the term. Originally, it kind of had two senses to it. The first one is hard to define, and it's easier for us to understand if we look at its opposite meaning. So the opposite of liberal in this sense was something like servile, mindless, mechanical labor, things that lower servants or slaves did, right? Did hard labor in fields, dug trenches. That was the opposite. The other one was associated with freedom, with liberal, right? You could think about the person who gets to sit and read a book instead of working, right? The person who works with their mind instead of works with their hands. That was kind of the contrast that's there. When I was an undergrad, I was still living with my parents, and I commuted to Liberty, and my parents have a wood stove, and they've always burned a lot of wood. And one of the things I really liked when I was an undergrad was I would spend all this time reading philosophy books and doing all of this mental labor. And then I would get to go and split wood. And it was the complete opposite of that. And it was oh, this is so nice. You're reading this dense philosophy and you're I don't understand anything. I don't know what you're trying to say here, and then you just grab this big metal stick and you hit a piece of wood with it and it breaks into two and you go, me did good. And then you do it again. And if it doesn't break into two, you just whack it again. And it's clear results. It's so simple. I don't have to think, you give your brain a rest. It was really nice. And so, right, you had the liberal things, which were about that mental work. And you had servile, mindless, mechanical labor. And that's not all bad. We need both of those things in there. But that was kind of the contrast, right? And so there's a very famous and important guy named John Henry Newman, who did a lot of talking about universities and stuff. But anyways, he says that liberal education and liberal pursuits are exercises of mind, of reason, of reflection, right? That's what liberal is about here. The other meaning of the sense of liberal, right? So not just kind of mental work or mind, reason, reflection. The other one is that it meant a generous or a plentiful or an ample amount of something, right? So you could say if somebody was very liberal with the butter when they made toast, it just means they used a lot of butter on their toast, right? So liberal can mean a lot, plentiful or ample amount. And so a liberal education was one that focused on developing the mind, on people's ability to think and to reason, and on those mental pursuits, not on practical, pragmatic, servile labor. And it was meant to be generous. It wasn't just a little bit of education. It was a lot of education over a lot of different things. And so a liberal education, it looked at a person holistically, and it aimed at the betterment of the person. It recognized that a person had a mind, and that for them to be a well-developed person, they needed to develop that mind. They needed to develop their abilities to think, right? They weren't just physical, that needed to be taken care of, but also the mental part. And we don't need to worry too much about this, but basically for a long time, a liberal education that focused on astronomy, math, geometry, and music. There's some interesting stuff here. If I just kind of do math here, the foundation of math is numbers. So what they had by math was like pure things like arithmetic, multiplication, things like that. It's just numbers. Now, numbers plus space gets you geometry, right? So now all of a sudden you have figures and shapes. And you can talk about all of those in relationships to numbers. It's this many units long, this many units wide. You can even make that three-dimensional and then start talking about how tall it is. But that's numbers in space. Music was numbers in time, right? So I don't know as much about music. I should have Jesse talk about this part of something, right? But like you have different time signatures in music. All musical notes can be converted to hertz, which is a frequency, which can be stated in numbers, right? So numbers in time, that's music. And then numbers in time and space is astronomy. So now you look at the universe and it's space and it moves in time, right? And so they see all of this as having related to numbers, right? And so it's an understanding of the world. Music is important. Music is valuable. It's connected to the wonderful world that we live in. It's connected to all of these things here. This math, that's not just some arbitrary thing. No, it's important. It helps us to understand music. It helps us to understand this table. It helps us to understand the stars and the heavens and the beautiful world that God made, right? It looks at things much more holistically. And then you had rhetoric, philosophy, and grammar. How to think, how to reason about things, and how to speak, right? Yeah, that'll work okay. And they thought, like, if a person can know all of these things well, then they'll be equipped to enter into the world and then to enjoy it. And I want to make an interesting contrast here. Does anybody know who Mark Ripito is? Has anybody heard of CrossFit? You guys know CrossFit? So he was one of the founders of CrossFit. So he was a powerlifting coach, and he trained a couple Olympic medalists in different weightlifting stuff, and then started CrossFit. He then left. He didn't like the way certain things were going, but he was one of the founders of CrossFit, Mark Ripito. And he's a pretty funny guy. He can be a little crass at times. But let me read you a quote that he said one time. He says, "A weak man is not as happy as that same man would be if he were strong." Right? And what's he getting at here? What he's getting at is, like, if you take somebody and you leave everything else the same, and all you do is you make this guy a little bit stronger, he'll be able to enjoy life more, right? When he has to go and move that couch, he's less likely to injure himself and he'll be happier. When he has to go and do something, he'll be able to do it instead of unable to do it. And he'll be a little happier, right? Have you ever like gone on a hike? You've gone up a steep mountain or something and you're like, like I'm gonna die. And all you're doing is like looking down at the path, like trying to struggle up this path or whatever it is, you know, to the top of this view, and you're missing everything around you, right? Because you're out of shape and you're barely able to breathe. If you were a little more fit, if you were a little stronger, you would be able to enjoy that a lot more. You'd be able to look around. You'd be able to see that. There's other paths that maybe you can't even go on because of that, right? Because you're not fit enough. My grandfather was in a wheelchair. One of the sad things about him being in a wheelchair was there's just certain things that he couldn't do. He couldn't do it because his legs didn't work, right? If you made my grandfather a little bit stronger, if you made his legs stronger, if you made it so that they could work again, right? Then there were things that he was able to go out and to do and to enjoy. That's Mark Ripeto's point here. And if you want to have some non-politically correct fun, you can Google Mark Ripito quotes and see other things that he says. I don't endorse all of it. There's a funny one where somebody said, when I deadlift, the bar really hurts my hands. I was thinking about getting gloves to wear. What do you think about that? And Mark Ripito told the guy, he said, well, if you get gloves, just make sure they match your purse. Right. So that's kind of the guy that Mark Ripito was. But anyways, but let's compare this quote by Mark Ripito with one from a Roman senator and orator, Cicero. Cicero says, we're all of us drawn to the pursuit of knowledge, in which to excel we consider excellent, whereas to mistake, to err, to be ignorant, to be deceived is both an evil and a disgrace. How many of you would like to have the nickname of like Captain Ignorant? Right? Or Lady Doofus? No, like we all recognize to be ignorant, to be deceived, that's not something that we take pride in, right? We want to know stuff. And part of the liberal education was that like there are things that people are missing if they don't have knowledge, if they don't have their minds developed to the point to where they can understand and appreciate and take in things, they miss it. They're like the person who's struggling up the mountain and isn't able to see what's around them. Like part of the reason I can't enjoy and appreciate classical music as much is because I don't know enough about music. If I knew more about it, I could enjoy it more. Part of the reason I don't enjoy poetry as much is because I don't understand how poetry works, right? And if I knew that, I could enjoy it a little bit more, right? Sometimes the reason that we don't enjoy mathematics is because we're, again, kind of doing the like, trying to go up the mountain. We're like, I don't know what this formula means. It's like, it's hard. It's like, if we could understand it better, we would go, oh my goodness, that's amazing. That is so cool, right? I think I might have time for this. Does anybody know what the sum of the interior angles of a triangle is?
180.
180. Can you prove it? Maybe.
Yeah, I mean.
I'll tell you what. You don't have to do it right now.
I mean, if you do like a right angled triangle and then with two 45s.
Okay. Yeah. So that would work. So what about though if we have like, a totally we could do like an isosceles triangle or something. Like how do we prove that or any possible conceivable triangle that the sum of its interior angles is 180? Well, that's kind of tricky, isn't it? Right? And so sometimes we learn something in math and our teachers are just like, this is what it is. It's 180. I have a lot of students that are like that. That's like, what's the interior angle? 180. Why? I don't know. They just know that. There's a really interesting like proof it's not real difficult to follow. Okay. A straight line is 180 degrees. That's just what a straight line is. 180. It's got to be something. They call it 180. If we do two straight lines and they're parallel, any line that's straight and intersects it, it'll intersect at the same angle. Okay, that's what it means by these being parallel. If they run exactly the same way, whatever intersects it will intersect at the same angle. If we do another line here, doesn't matter how we do these lines at all. We can squish this up. We can draw this more at an angle. It doesn't matter. Then the same thing is going to happen here. So if you look, we have three angles here, A, B, and C. We don't know what A is. We don't know what B is. We don't know what C is. But we know that A plus B plus C equals 180, right? Because this is a straight line and that's what it's broken up into. We know this is a straight line. We know this intersects at the same angle. So on this side is B and C, and on this side is A. This side is A, B, and on this side is C. And then there's kind of a fun way to do it. Well, here's another straight line. We already have A and B, so what are we missing? We're missing C that's here. And then here's another straight line. We already have A and C, so what are we missing? We're missing B. What are our interior angles? A, B, and C. 180 degrees. That works for every triangle, right? When you can see that, you're like, oh, that's kind of interesting. Oh, I can kind of follow that. I can kind of appreciate it, right? When we can see and understand things, we start to see the beauty in it, right? And it's really when it's hidden from our eyes, when it's too difficult, when we can't follow it, that's when we miss it. And so part of that liberal education was just like that strong person can go out and can do things and can experience the world. The intellectual person, the liberally educated person, can go out and experience the world and see beauty in literature, see beauty in poetry, see beauty in nature, see beauty in the stars, right? See beauty in all of these sorts of things because they're equipped for it. See beauty in mathematics, right? Um, a liberal education aimed at character formation so that people would naturally choose what is good. It aimed at inspiring the infection so that people would love what is good. They would see the good, they would choose it, and they would love it. Right? That's one of the things that Abby very helpfully mentioned when we talked about literature a while back, right? Is that she talked about like, oh, I see these characters that do the right sort of thing and it inspires me. It makes me want to do the right sorts of things, right? It helps us to love what is good. That's something that good poetry does, good literature does. It develops the intellect, our ability to think and to reason. And it develops our judgment, our ability to discern and to decide rightly, to make wise decisions. Should I go to this college or should I go to this college? Should I pursue this path or should I pursue this path, right? Your ability to think, to see what's good and right, that is going to help you with that, right? And so it saw all of these as being related to each other and education as being something that was meant to do this. It wasn't meant to help you be a good engineer. It wasn't meant to help you build bridges. It wasn't meant to turn you into a scientist. It wasn't meant to help you make money. It was meant to help you be a better human, right? That's what it was aimed at. And this is the way that education was for a long time. And I hope that this next slide isn't like me beating a dead horse too much. But I want to point out that we have lost that. That is not what education is about anymore. And so really, I just covered up to about the year 1000 AD, right? And these are all people that are talking about education, that see it as about those things of character formation, of developing judgment and stuff. I'm not necessarily going to go through all of these, but I wanted to just kind of like put this up as a way of painting a picture, right? Basically, from this guy forwards, it's all Christians, all talking about the importance of understanding, of learning, of developing our minds, of learning math, learning science, of learning literature, poetry, art, music, all of these sorts of things. The first couple here are not Christians. Let me just read them real quickly. Aristotle says there is a sort of education which parents should train their sons, not as being useful or necessary, but because it is liberal or noble. To be seeking always after the useful does not become free and exalted souls. Cicero says all literature, all philosophy, all history abounds with incentives to noble action. Seneca says, after listing the areas of study in the liberal arts, he says, what service to God is there in this contemplation that the greatness of his work be not without witness, right? We miss the beauty of the world that God made when we fail to understand it. And then what Clement of Alexandria does, and this is something that all of the leading church thinkers throughout church history for goodness, 1800 years probably, all do, is they say something like this. Before the Lord's coming, philosophy, and they mean philosophy in a very general term here, right? Covering, like, we could almost insert liberal education. It was an essential guide to righteousness for the Greeks. At the present time, it is a useful guide towards reverence for God. one of the things that a lot of these authors did is they would talk about the Exodus story. You know, in the Exodus story, God punishes the Egyptians. And at the end, after the 10th and final plague, they're like, please go, please leave, take our things. Would you? Oh, you like this clock? Here, it's yours. Please get out of Egypt and go away. Right? And so they give them all of these presents and gifts. And they say that's what a lot of this pagan learning did. Right? These were when they learned things about God's world, right? That is a good and noble thing, and we should take them, right? You should not take everything that they have. They have a lot of false things. They have a lot of bad things. We don't do that. But when they see the world rightly, when they understand the nature of the physical universe, when they understand math, when they have great things in literature and poetry and art and all of that stuff, these are the gifts of the Egyptians. And we should take those and say, thank you very much. And we should move on, right, with them. We don't leave them behind. We don't cast aspersions on them and say, that's all Egyptian stuff. I don't want that. I'm an Israelite. No. We adopt it, right? We take it in and then we offer it as service to God, right? So what is it that then happens later on in the Exodus story? God's like, build a tabernacle. I want these things in it. All right, well, let's melt down the gold. Where'd they get the gold stuff from? From the Egyptians, right? It's repurposed for God, right? And that's how they saw this. And again, like this is the way that education was for, again, largely 1700 years at least it was like that. And now it's not anymore. What has happened? And so I want to kind of talk about this. The loss of the great tradition is what I'm kind of going to call it here. And you could, I was really kind of debating a little bit about these dates here. So don't think of these dates as being like set in stone or something like that. They're nice round numbers and approximations. When I was looking at stuff, some of it, a lot of the discussion I was looking at concerned America and England. And England is kind of ahead of schedule of us. So stuff that happens in the US is a little bit later than what the same thing happened in England, but it's roughly around this time here. So around 1900, two important things happen. The first thing is that work at factories and outside the home becomes standard. What happened before was Dad was a blacksmith. Where was his blacksmith shop? At the garage, at home, the building right next door to the house, right? Who helped him? His son, right? Right? Hand me that tool. Do this, do that. The dad was a farmer. Where was he a farmer at? His home. He walked behind his house instead of beside of his house, and he worked in the field. Who was his helper? His dad, right? Or his son, his kid. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I said it backwards. Yeah, right? And all of a sudden, factories and stuff took off and all of that stuff. Now what does Dad do? He leaves home.
Mm-hmm.
Where's the son? Well, son stays at home.
Mm-hmm.
Right? He leaves. Right? That's one of the big things that happens. And one of the things that happened was, too, like education became more and more neglected. It became more and more of a problem. Right? And for those of you who went through the membership class with me, if you remember, I talked about John Wesley, and John Wesley kind of came into England. One of the big problems was that, like, you know, there was a lot of drunkenness, debauchery, and stuff, and the poor were just really being overlooked too. And the origin of Sunday school actually comes from Wesley. And what happened was they realized there's all these kids, there's all these people that are stuck working in these factory jobs, right? They're stuck with these not so great like options for life. And it's because they can't read, they can't do math, they can't learn, they don't have the ability to have education. So let's start offering that. Let's start providing that. And so Sunday school was school on Sunday. I was like, come to church early, we'll teach you how to read. You can read the Bible, you can read, you know, other books to become a lawyer. We'll teach you math. Guess what? Now you can become, you know, you can do taxes, or you can do this, you know, you can become a businessman, something like that. It was a way of helping and bettering people. And that really caught on and that became good. And that started to become more and more popular, more and more prevalent, right? And so what happened was people with very good intentions were like, we want this for everybody. So let's have the government do it. Let's have the state do it. Then they can give it to everybody, right? And so they were trying to do something good and helpful. But what before was something that families were responsible for. Families were responsible for teaching their children, right? Or private schools taught children. That was not something that the state was in charge of, right? That shift, it went from being something private to then being something that was done at the state level, at the government. The government was now in charge of education. That shift happened. And this required the state to expand and to rethink education. Let me give you a quote here from a very important person named Christopher Dawson, who did a lot of work on this. Dawson says, once the state has accepted full responsibility for the education of the whole youth of the nation, it is obliged to extend its control further and further into new fields, to the physical welfare of its pupils, to their feeding and medical care, to their amusements and the use of their spare time, and finally to their moral welfare and their psychological guidance. Thus, universal education involves the creation of an immense machinery of organization and control, which must go on growing in power and influence until it covers the whole field of culture and embraces every form of educational institution, from the nursery school to the university, right? If you make education a right, the government has an obligation to make sure that everybody has it, right? You have a right to live. So if somebody tries to kill you, the government steps in and says, you can't do that. And they send people to prison, right? You have a right to education. Well, what if you can't get there? Well, we have to provide that for you.
Yeah.
Well, what if you don't have it? Well, we have to provide that for you. Well, what if you don't? Well, we have to do that. And it has to rapidly and massively expand the control of the government because you've made it a right. You've made it an obligation, right? Can the state push Christian values? Can the state say, this is the kind of person you ought to be?
No.
Oh, no, it's not supposed to do that. So what's it do? It tries to be neutral, which is being secular. And trying to be non-religious, it becomes anti-religious, right? You cannot be value neutral, right? You have to push things as value. So it's got to rethink. Well, we can't say this is the kind of person you ought to be, right? So what's the point of education? What are we trying to do with people here? Well, one, it's got to be secular, which means non-Christian, anti-religious, right? That's what winds up happening. And you just see there's this rapid decline in religion in schools, right? That's a natural overflow of it being a government-funded, run, controlled project, right?
I remember going to Bible study when I was in elementary school. We
Mhm,
used to go, yeah, it used to be like once a week. You go to a little side trailer
mhm.
and we would have, but they don't do that anymore.
Yeah, and it's because people have pushed back against it.
Yeah. I don't think they say the Pledge of Allegiance anymore.
No, yeah.
Yeah.
And again, they've said like, you're pushing values. And then the government goes, oh yeah, we are. Well, we'll just cut it out then, right? And that starts to become problematic. So what kind of people should we be making? Well, education has to be useful, but useful to whom and for what? I don't know why there's a plus there. Ignore that. Right? Useful to whom and for what? Useful to the state. Since the government is doing it and the government is controlling it, it's going to make people that are fit to be governed. It's going to make people that are going to be fit to be part of its little state
Society.
organization. And how it wants society to be, it's going to try and make people in that image,
Yeah.
right? Because it's going to try and make the kind of people that it wants, and it wants control over those people, right? And it's going to make them fit for factory work, right? So what is it that gets pushed? Usefulness, right? What's education about? Well, it's about, we'll sell it as it's about them getting jobs and money and all of that stuff. but really it's about us getting what we want,
Mhm.
right? More technology, more cars, more this, more that, right? That's what it's about now. And I'm gonna go back again to Christopher Dawson. No, sorry, it's not about your mustache. That's just a quote. Sorry, Chris. Christopher Dawson says, education is not concerned with intellectual values. Its end is not to communicate knowledge or to train scholars in the liberal arts. It exists simply to serve democracy, the state. And as long as religion is regarded as a private matter which only concerns the conscience and the feelings of the individual, oh, it's a very good thing. But the moment that it attempts to create its own community of thought and to separate its adherents from the common mind of the democratic society and from the state school, which is the organ of that common mind, it becomes an antisocial force which every good Democrat must reject and condemn. Right? These are, again, just things that naturally flow out of making the state the big controller of the government, making education, or making the state the big controller of government, making the state the big controller of education, and making education about like being useful, about making money and that stuff, right? And we've just lost this picture of it being about us developing ourselves and knowing ourselves and becoming better people. So these are what I'm kind of calling some unpopular facts here. Those who can't see miss beauty. People who are born blind don't see sunsets. They don't see sunlight. They don't see flowers. They don't see colors. They miss beauty. Those who can't hear miss music. They don't hear music. Those who can't think miss truth. They miss that. And those who can't do right miss goodness. And the older view of education was it was about getting people who can see, who can hear, who can think, and who can act. If you can develop people like that, you know what? The cars will take care of themselves. The banking will take care of itself. The engineering will take care of itself. This is what we need to produce. This is what education is about. And again, that guy whose name I struggle with, Awais Rafudin, something like that, says the study of humanities is meant to become a passionate, personally transformative engagement with reality. Right? That's what it's about. As we hear the music and it transforms us and we love it and we appreciate God's world and we see or read good literature and we appreciate it and we love God's world. We start to understand things about triangles and about trees and about biology, and we see the goodness and the beauty in it, right? And I think, yeah, I think I have time to go through this real quickly here. So again, kind of in summary, the humanities are very much about gaining knowledge so that we can make a lot of money.
Mm-mm.
No. Yes, humanities professors have to pay. Right? No, not about money. So that we can land people on the moon. No. Cure cancer? Well, that's a good thing, but no. Build a better bomb. No. So that we can better ourselves.
Develop ourselves.
That's what it's about. Yeah. And the good news is it's never too late to start learning, right? You can learn about music. You can learn about history. You can learn about good literature. You can start reading fiction. You can start engaging with these things here. So I think that's it. I managed to finish pretty close on time. Any closing thoughts, questions, emotional outbursts?
Oh, my goodness.
Almost spilled my drink. All right, well, on that high note, we'll call it quits. I'll see you guys next week.